Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Saturday night while the World Series is in Game 7, extra innings, and our beloved Dodgers are in it. Sorry, I'm starting late. I was hoping the game would be over by now. I couldn't delay anymore. Obviously, we got people on the East Coast. I'm not going to just keep it going, but wow, my family's very invested in this game. So, let's go. Our daf tonight is page 43 here in Tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud. Continuing our discussion, Mishnah number 1, which we're going to wrap up, hopefully, God willing, here in chapter 4. We did a double before, so here we're close to the top of page 42b. The Gemara returns to discuss the Baraisa that addresses the blood presented inside the sanctuary, remembering that as we've seen for offerings that have blood sprinklings done inside the sanctuary. Now that's going to include not only the offerings of Yom Kippur, but also the bull brought for an erroneous ruling, erroneous action of the Sanhedrin that the population relies on, or a mistake that the anointed priest made, or if the population committed a vodah zarah. So then there's sprinklings inside the sanctuary that includes on the golden altar. The Yom Kippur offering is the only one where there's sprinkling inside the Holy of Holies. And for all these kinds of inner offerings, every presentation of the blood, every sprinkling of the blood is necessary in order to achieve the atonement, to fulfill the obligations. And therefore, in order to render the offering pigul, the priest doing it would have to have a pigul intention in every single one of the sprinklings, as opposed to outer offerings, normal everyday offerings that are if there's a sprinkling that has to happen on the external altar, it's really only the first sprinkling that affects atonement. If the other ones aren't done, the atonement would still be affected, right? Some general principles there. Gemara returns to discuss the Baraisa that addresses the blood presented inside the sanctuary. The master said that if the high priest had an improper intention in one of the sets of presentations, for example, inside the Holy of Holies, so that'd be Yom Kippur, Rabbi Meir says the offering is pigul, and one is liable to receive kares for its consumption, right? If something is rendered pigul, if you had an intention to consume the meat or to burn it on the altar, if it's like an Ulla, beyond its designated time, at the time of slaughter or of sprinkling, that would render the offering pigul, and that means that if someone then ate of that offering, that would be a kares-bearing penalty. That's why these two things go together. So Rabbi Meir says the offering is pigul and one is liable to receive kares for its consumption, despite the fact that he performed the rest of the rite silently, didn't have any intention at all. We've said he has to have that pigul intention throughout all of the sprinklings, but Rabbi Meir is projecting his initial intention onto the rest of the sprinklings, or presentations is another word for the same idea. So the Gemara asks, now consider, one is not liable to receive kares unless all the permitting factors of the offering have been sacrificed, i.e., if the whole service is completed, including the presentation of the blood. As the master said, as is the acceptance of a valid offering, so is the lack of acceptance of a disqualified offering. Therefore, just as there is no acceptance of a valid offering unless all its permitting factors have been sacrificed, so too there is no lack of acceptance of a disqualified offering. In other words, it is not rendered pigul unless all its permitting factors have been sacrificed. That is to say, in the absence of one of its permitting factors, it does not become pigul. So if he had this pigul intention when he did the sprinklings inside the Holy of Holies, but we said that to effect atonement on Yom Kippur, he has to do all of the presentations. Some say 43, some say 47, some say 48 sprinklings that the high priest is doing all day long on Yom Kippur. If any one of them is done wrong, he has to start all over, or he hasn't done anything at all. So how can it be that if the priest had an intent to consume beyond its time during some of those presentations, that the offering could be rendered pigul? How could it be rendered pigul if you might say, well, so he had a pigul intention, a pigul bearing intention during all the sprinklings. But if he did some of those sprinklings with a pigul intention, he hasn't done those sprinklings at all. So now the rest of the day needs to be canceled. He has to start all over again. How could he even have the wrong intention during the rest of the sprinklings now that he has already messed up these earlier ones? Right? But here, in the case of the bull or the goat of Yom Kippur, since he intended to burn the offering beyond its designated time while he was sprinkling the blood inside the Holy of Holies, the sprinkling is not valid. And therefore, the high priest is considered like one who did not sprinkle the blood at all, as every one of the sprinklings of the blood of an inner offering is indispensable. If so, when he sprinkles the blood again later in the sanctuary, on the curtain and on the inner altar, it is as though he is merely sprinkling water and not the blood of the offering. Consequently, the permitting factors of the offering have not been sacrificed, and therefore the offering cannot be rendered pigul. So how could Rabbi Meir say that it is rendered pigul? Rabbah says you find it in a case of 4 bulls and of 4 goats. Does the high priest bring 4 bulls and 4 goats on Yom Kippur? No, of course not. That means that he messed up and he was involved in do-overs. After sprinkling blood inside the Holy of Holies with the intent to burn the offering beyond its designated time, the blood spilled. Since the priest did not use that blood again, the service inside the Holy of Holies was completed, and that permitting factor was performed properly. He then had to go out and slaughter another bull and another goat for the other sprinklings inside the sanctuary, which he again performed with improper intent, and then again the blood spilled. The same sequence repeated itself in the sprinklings on the inner altar and on the top of the altar. In this manner, each permitting factor was performed properly, but with wrong intention, right? This is beyond unimaginable, right? This is a hypothetical that can never happen, that he's going to keep repeating the pattern of doing everything right, except he had the wrong intention. Wow, huge mess up. Go out, slaughter another animal. Already the nation will be like, what the heck's going on? The high priest is slaughtering a second animal because he messed up something inside. And then he goes in again and does the next step with this blood of this new animal and messes it up again. This would never happen. But we're challenging our understanding of the law. Rava said, you may even say that this is a case where there is only 1 bull and 1 goat, as the sprinkling affects acceptance with regard to the offering's status of pigul. What's he saying? In other words, even though the high priest sprinkled the blood inside the Holy of Holies with an improper intention and thereby disqualified the offering, nevertheless, since he completed the service, he is considered as having sacrificed all the permitting factors with regard to pigul. This would be a case where, okay, he had the wrong intention at the time, but he didn't say anything. He just went on and completed the service, and he was thinking the wrong intention. He had some mistaken intention throughout all of what would otherwise look like a correct performance of the whole Yom Kippur service. And then maybe only at the end of all of it, he realized that he was holding this wrong intention during all the steps. And then that maybe would work, according to Rabbi Meir, rendering it pigul. New topic. The Baraisa mentioned that there are 43 presentations of the blood of the bull and the goat on Yom Kippur. The Gemara asks, but isn't it taught otherwise in a different Baraisa? That there are 47 presentations of that blood. And the Gemara answers, this statement that there are 43 presentations is in accordance with the opinion of the one who says that the high priest mixes the blood of the bull and the goat before placing it on the corners of the inner altar, rather than placing the blood of each one separately. And that statement that there are 47 presentations is in accordance with the opinion of the one who says that the high priest does not mix the 2 types of blood before placing them on the corners, but rather sprinkles 4 times from the blood of the bull and another 4 times from the blood of the goat, and only afterward mixes the blood of the 2 animals together for placement on top of the inner altar. The Gemara raises another difficulty. But isn't it taught in yet another baraisa that there are 48 presentations of blood on Yom Kippur? And the Gemara answers, this statement that there are 48 presentations is in accordance with the opinion of the one who says that the pouring of the remainder of the blood on the base of the external altar, the everyday altar, is indispensable, and therefore this act is added to the total. The other opinion would be that once he has achieved all the sprinklings inside the sanctuary, and some of them even inside the Holy of Holies, then he has to pour out the remainder of the blood on the base of the altar. That is the right procedure, but if something went wrong and he wasn't able to pour it out on the base of the altar, the atonement of Yom Kippur would still have been achieved on behalf of the nation. But this, I think it's a minority opinion, says, no, pouring it out on the base of the altar is as indispensable as all the sprinklings. That statement that there are 47 is in accordance with the opinion of the one who says that the pouring of the remainder of the blood on the base of the external altar is not indispensable. The Gemara raises an objection to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish's understanding of Rabbi Meir's opinion that one cannot render an offering pigul with an improper intention during the performance of half a permitting factor. Remember, permitting factor means that you have to do all the steps of the ritual before you can go on to the next step of the ritual. If it was a sin offering, then some of that meat is eaten by the priests, so they can't eat it until all the permitting factors have been achieved. And it's these permitting factors, it's during the performance of those that an improper intent to consume beyond its designated time can create pigul. So the Gemara raises an objection to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish's understanding of Rabbi Meir's opinion that one cannot render an offering pigul with an improper intention during the performance of half a permitting factor from a baraisa that was discussing pigul of a meal offering, not an animal, but a handful of flour, which states in what cases this statement said, i.e. that if the priest had an improper intention during the performance of one of its services, the offering is pigul, despite the fact that he performed the rest of the services silently. When he had the improper intention in the removal of the handful, or in the placement of the handful in a service vessel, or in the walking with the handful to the altar. These are the necessary steps when one is bringing a mincha, a meal offering. But if he came to perform the burning of the handful and the frankincense, and he presented the handful on the altar with an improper intention, and the frankincense he presented silently, or he presented the handful silently and the frankincense he presented with an improper intention, Rabbi Meir says the offering is pigul, and one is liable to receive kares for consuming it. And the rabbis say, meaning the majority who overrule Rabbi Meir, there is no liability to receive kares unless the priest had an improper intention that can render the offering pigul during the performance of the entire permitting factor. In any event, this baraisa teaches, or he presented the handful silently and the frankincense he presented with improper intention, and yet Rabbi Meir disagrees with the ruling of the rabbis and says that the offering is pigul. This disagreement indicates that the decisive factor, according to Rabbi Meir, is not that the priest continues his initial intent, but rather that one can render an offering pigul during the performance of half a permitting factor. And the Gemara answers, say and explain the baraisa as follows. Or he presented the handful silently after he had already presented the frankincense with the improper intention. In this case, the offering is pigul because he performed the second action with his initial intent. Now, the Gemara refutes this interpretation by saying one can counterclaim that if this is what the baraisa is saying, this is exactly the same case as the first clause. And furthermore, isn't it taught explicitly in another baraisa? And afterward, he presented the frankincense with an improper intention. And the Gemara states, indeed, this is difficult for the opinion of Reish Lakish, who claims that according to Rabbi Meir, one cannot render an offering pigul during the performance of half a permitting factor. And that ends the discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 4. We move on to Mishnah 2. And these are the items for which one is not liable to receive kares due to violation of the prohibition of pigul. And so the Gemara, now the editors of the Koran explain, or in this case Rav Steinsaltz is explaining it to us, one is liable to receive kares only if he partakes of an item that was permitted for consumption or for the altar, right? Permitted for consumption would be a sin offering, where part of it is going to be eaten by the priests, or consumption by the altar means a burnt offering, or the other parts of a sin offering that are going to be burnt on the altar, and that is only that we only move on to that step of the offering process after the sprinklings have been done correctly. Now, so the point is that you have to have this faulty intention to then to eat, partake, or burn on the altar beyond the designated time during those permitting steps, right? The slaughter, collecting the blood, conveying the blood, sprinkling the blood, etc., as we've discussed a bunch of times, during those permitting steps, right? The permitting steps. So one is liable to receive kares only if he partakes of an item that was, that's how you render something pigul, by having that intention during those steps. Now let's say it has been rendered pigul. When you don't receive kares because you rendered something pigul. Now you've made that the flesh of that animal pigul. That means it cannot be eaten, and it cannot be consumed by the altar. If a person then eats of it or puts it on the altar to be consumed, then he would receive kares, right? So that's what we're talking about now. So one is liable to receive kares only if he partakes of an item that was permitted for consumption or for the altar by another item. As for the items listed here, either nothing else renders them permitted for consumption or for the altar, or they themselves render other items permitted. And they are as follows: the handful of flour, which permits consumption of the meal offering. Okay, my family, please stop texting. Oh, did we win? Oh, we won the World Series. Yeah! Okay, Nina, please stop the texting on the family chat so I can teach the class. Wow, did I miss? Okay, well, Dodgers won! Dodgers won! And we were learning a difficult passage here in Tractate Zevachim. Okay, stop texting. You're killing me. One is liable to receive kares only if he partakes of an item that was permitted for consumption or for the altar by another item. As for the items listed here, either nothing else renders them permitted for consumption or for the altar, or they themselves render other items permitted. And what items are these? How does this work? The handful of flour, which permits consumption of the meal offering, the incense, which is burned in its entirety, without another item, rendering it permitted for the altar, the frankincense, which is burned together with the handful of the meal offering, now we're at the top of 43a, the meal offering of priests, from which no handful of flour is removed and which is burned in its entirety, the meal offering of the anointed priest, which is sacrificed by the high priest each day, half in the morning and half in the evening, the blood, which permits all the offerings, and the libations that are brought by themselves as a separate offering and do not accompany an animal offering. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. And the rabbis say the same law applies even with regard to libations that are brought with an animal offering. Okay? With regard to the log of oil that accompanies the guilt offering of a recovered metzora, Rabbi Shimon says one is not liable for consuming it due to violation of the prohibition of pigul because it is not permitted by any other item. And Rabbi Meir says one is liable for consuming it due to the violation of the prohibition of pigul, as the blood of the guilt offering of... Okay, let me just turn this off, please. Focus. Showtime. Okay. Rabbi Shimon says one is not liable for consuming it due to the violation of pigul because it is not permitted by another item. And Rabbi Meir says one is liable for consuming it due to the violation of the prohibition of pigul, as the blood of the guilt offering of the mitzvah permits its use, as only after the blood sacrifice is the oil sprinkled and given to the priests. And the principle is, with regard to any item that has permitting factors, either for consumption by a person or for burning by the altar, one is liable for eating it due to the violation of the prohibition of pigul, right? So simple case, sin offering. when all the sprinkling is done correctly, right? The slaughter was done correctly, that the blood was collected, conveyed, and sprinkled correctly. And if the person doing that had an intention to eat it beyond its time, he would have rendered it pigul. And then if you ate that meat, if a priest ate that meat that has now been rendered pigul, he would be subject to kares. But if obviously people don't do this, we're prohibited to eat blood anyway. But if he did eat of that blood, that would not be a kares-bearing penalty because the blood is the permitting factor for the meat, right? And it's the permitting factor. If you eat from that, you don't get kares. You violated other prohibitions, but it's not kares for that reason. Whereas if you ate the meat that had become permitted through that process that resulted in pigul, then you would receive kares. And the Mishnah elaborates, the burnt offering, its blood permits its flesh to be burned on the altar and its hide to be used by the priests. The bird, burnt offering, its blood permits its flesh and its skin to be burned on the altar. The bird, sin offering, its blood permits its meat for consumption by the priests. Bulls that are burned, for example, the bull for an unwitting communal sin, and goats that are burned, for example, the goats sacrificed for an unwitting communal sin of idol worship, their blood permits their sacrificial portions to be sacrificed on the altar. And Rabbi Shimon says the bulls and the goats are not subject to pigul because their blood is presented in the sanctuary. And in the case of any offering whose blood is not presented on the external altar, like that of a peace offering, with regard to which the law of pigul was stated in the Torah, one is not liable for eating it due to violation of the prohibition of pigul. And we'll see why as we get into the Gemara. That was the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. Sharon says, my Yankees fan husband is not amused. Woo! Yeah, okay. It was not easy to come in here, teach this class in the 10th inning of the extra innings Game 7 World Series with our Dodgers in the game. But we got to do what we're obligated to do. And tonight I was obligated to teach you if it was at all possible for me. And so we soldier on. The Gemara. Ulla says, with regard to a handful of a meal offering that is pigul. Slow down. Ulla says, with regard to a handful of a meal offering that is pigul, that was offered up on the altar, its pigul status has left it. And his reasoning is as follows. If this handful brings other items to a status of pigul, with regard to itself, is it not all the more so? Right? So we're talking about, now there are some offerings that have ancillary, I don't know how I'm putting this, like ancillary offerings, right? So for example, when you bring certain kinds of, guilt offerings, or say for thanks offerings, right? Thanks offerings, you not only bring the animal, you have to bring loaves of bread that go with it. And there's going to be some offerings that are accompanied by a meal offering, right? There's going to be grouped offerings. So if, as we've seen in this Mishnah, something has to happen correctly for that part of the offering to become eligible for consumption, either people eating it or being burned on the altar, then the permitting factors, if you eat those were done with the wrong intent, therefore the meat was rendered pigul. If you now go and eat the thing that is a permitting factor, right, that would not result in kares, right? That's the basic premise of what we're talking about here. So what about if the meal offering accompanies itself in the sense that there's also frankincense that goes with it? Let's just read this slowly. So his reasoning is as follows. If this handful brings other items to a status of pigul, with regard to itself, is it not all the more so? But the Gemara says, what is Ulla saying? This consideration does not explain why the status of pigul should leave the handful, right? If you're saying it's pigul, that means that you can't eat it and you can't place it on the altar to be burned on the altar. So why would Ulla say, well, then when you place it on the altar, its pigul status leaves it? What's he saying? The Gemara answers that this is what he is saying. If the handful is not accepted, i.e. if its sacrifice is disqualified, How can it bring other items to a status of pigul? A meal offering is considered pigul only if its handful is properly sacrificed, properly, the action is done properly, the intent was wrong. The Gemara asks, what is Ulla teaching us? If he is teaching us that one is not liable for eating the handful due to violation of the prohibition of pigul, we learn this in the Mishnah. These are the items for which one is not liable due to pigul. The handful, the incense, the frankincense, the meal offering of priests, the meal offering of the anointed priest, the meal offering brought with libations that accompany animal offerings, and the blood. If so, one is not liable for eating the handful, even if it was not offered up on the altar. Rather, Ulla is teaching that if items with a pigul status ascended the altar, they shall not descend. Now we're talking about something that sounds super complicated, but is actually a lot simpler. If we're saying that an item has been rendered pigul, and therefore you can't eat it, and you can't let it be consumed on the altar. In essence, heaven is eating it when something is consumed on the altar. So if it's pigul, consumption is prohibited either by a person or by the altar. So you shouldn't have done that. But you did put it on the altar. Now it's there, and let's say you're sitting there and you got your fireproof gloves, and you're like, oh my God, that should have gone on the altar. Do you reach in and pull it out? Ulla's saying no. Once it goes up on the fire, you don't take it off the fire, even if it never should have gone on the fire in the first place. Rather, Ulla is teaching that if items with a pigul status ascended the altar, they shall not descend. But this too, we already learn in a Mishnah on page 84a. With regard to the flesh of sacrifices that is left overnight, or that emerges from the temple courtyard, or that is ritually impure, tameh, or an offering that was slaughtered with the intention of eating the meat beyond its designated time or outside its designated area, thereby acquiring the status of pigul, if any one of these ascended the altar, they shall not descend. So it must be that Ulla is not teaching that. He's teaching us something else. What is it? Rather, Ulla is teaching that if items with pigul status descended from the altar after having been brought up there, they ascend once again, right? So the rule is, it's pigul, it shouldn't go on the altar. By mistake, we put it on the altar anyway. Now the rule is, you put it on the altar anyway, let it burn, don't pull it out of the fire. Okay? But somebody forgot that rule, and when he realized it shouldn't have been in the altar, he instinctively went in and took it off the fire. Now the rule is, put it back on the fire. Put it back on the fire. You shouldn't have put it in the first place, but you did. Then you shouldn't have pulled it out, but you did. Put it back. But we also learned in that same Mishnah on 84b that this is not so. Just as if they ascended the altar, they shall not descend, so too, if they descended from the altar, they shall not ascend. Okay, you shouldn't have taken it out, but you did. Don't put it back. The Gemara answers no. Ulla's ruling is necessary in a case where the fire has already taken hold of it, i.e. the handful began to burn before it came down from the altar. So Ulla teaches that in such a case, the priest should return the handful to the altar, as its pigul status has already left it by this sequence of events. Now it's beyond being pigul. It's no longer considered pigul, so you can put it back on the fire and let it burn out. The Gemara raises difficulty. But this law also, Ulla said it on another occasion. As Ulla says, the Mishnah taught that items that descended from the altar shall not ascend again, only where the fire has not taken hold of them, but where the fire has already taken hold of them, they shall ascend. So if he's already said it explicitly, that must not be the implication of what he's saying in a roundabout way here. So the Gemara explains, even so, there is a novelty in this ruling that we're discussing now, lest you say that this matter applies only to a limb of an offering, which is all connected together so that it forms a single unit. And one can say that if the fire took hold of part of it, all of it is considered the food of the altar, and therefore it is returned to the altar once the fire took hold of it, if it came down mistakenly. But with regard to a handful which consists of separate pieces, right? it's a limb of an animal is different than a handful of flour, which is made of a bunch of different grains of flour. So you might have thought that we don't return the handful of flour to the altar. Therefore, Ulla teaches us that the same law applies to the handful as to a limb of the sacrifice, i.e. if it descended from the altar after fire had already took hold of any part of it, it ascends once again in its entirety to the altar. We are on page 43b. I'm actually almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Rav Achai says, since the handful is considered one unit, therefore, in the case of this handful of pigul, half of which lies on the ground and half of which was brought up to the wood arrangement on the altar, and the fire took hold of it, one brings all of it up to the altar ab initio. Rabbi Yitzchak says that Rabbi Yochanan says, with regard to the pigul notar, i.e. offerings that remain after the time allotted for their consumption, and ritually impure flesh, where one brought them up to the altar, their prohibition has left them. Rav Hizda said in astonishment, teacher of this halacha, is the altar a bath of ritual purification? In other words, is the altar a mikvah that can render an impure item pure? And Rabbi Zera says, that's not what he's saying. This is referring to a case where the fire took hold of them, and therefore the item belongs to the altar, and the prohibition to put it back on the altar is no longer there, because now the operative, now the circumstances have changed, right? There's many times when, you have plan A, and you're hoping everything's going to go according to plan. Things go totally awry. Well, now you're in a new situation. This thing should not have gone up on the altar. It was placed on the altar. Fire took hold of it, and then it was pulled off the altar. That was also a mistake. At this point, since fire took hold of it, you no longer are concerned about the initial prohibition that it shouldn't go on the altar. That prohibition is left. Now we place it back on the altar because it's something that was on the altar and the fire took hold of it. Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Bizna raises an objection from a baraisa. Others say, sounds like Acherum, Rabbi Meir, the verse states, but the soul that eats of the meat of the sacrifice of peace offerings which pertain to the Lord, having his impurity upon him, if he's tameh, that soul shall be cut off from his people. Karas. So although this can also be read as having its impurity upon it, right? Are we talking about a person who is tameh, who is eating the sacrificial portions of an offering that can be eaten, right? Either preceding from a sin offering or a person eating from a peace offering, the person has to be tahor, ritually pure. Or are we saying that the offering itself became tameh and you can't eat it then? Since it can also be read as having its impurity upon it, referring to the meat of the peace offerings, the verse, in fact, is referring to one whose impurity can depart from him. A person who is currently tameh, but can attain a state of ritual purity by immersing in a mikvah. And this serves to exclude the impure flesh of offerings, right? Once the meat of an offering becomes tameh, you can't purify it, you can't immerse it in a mikvah, it's never going to be tahor again. A person who becomes tameh, of course, can become tahor again. And if it is so that Rabbi Yochanan's statement is correct, the impurity of flesh can, in fact, depart from it by means of the fire of the altar. Right? We've said, well, no, meat can never become tahor again. But if you're saying that by putting something on the altar, you should have done it, but if you did, then its prohibition leaves it. Okay, well, its prohibition leaves it, but it was prohibited because it was pigul. Now, it could be prohibited because someone is tameh. But if it goes on the altar, it shouldn't have because it was tameh. But then somebody pulled it out after the fire had taken hold, and now we're saying we're going to put it back on the altar. Well, then you're saying its prohibition has left it. Now, if its initial prohibition was due to it being tameh, are we saying that it is no longer tameh, and that's why we can put it back on the altar fire? In that case, are we saying that the altar fire has acted as a kind of mikvah? That's the question being asked. So Rava says, when the Baraisa speaks of an item whose impurity cannot depart from it, we say it is referring to purification by means of a mikvah, a ritual bath, and not through any other means. The Gemara raised a difficulty with this statement. Is the term mikvah written in the Baraisa? It speaks only in general terms about impurity that can or cannot depart from an item. So rather, Rav Papa says in that verse, we are dealing with the meat of peace offerings, which are not fit for sacrificing, as the meat of a peace offering is eaten rather than being burned on the altar. Therefore, bringing it up to the altar does not remove its impurity from it. Ravina says there is a different answer. Even if the impurity of flesh leaves it when it was brought up to the altar, this verse cannot be referring to the impure meat of peace offerings, as the phrase having its impurity upon him is referring to one whose impurity departs from him when he is whole. The term upon him indicates that he is in a state of wholeness. And this serves to exclude sacrificial flesh, which is an item whose impurity does not depart from it when it is whole, but only when it is deficient, i.e. when fire takes hold of it upon the altar. This is utterly distinct from a living person who can become tameh and then tahor by immersing in the mikvah. That's where we're going to stop Sunday. Okay. And let me see if there's comments here that Nina has passed to me. Sorry, I didn't load up that page. Okay, Sharon, I remain bewildered about how intentions of the priest becomes known. Do they say, wait, I have an improper intention? If they say nothing and all proceeds, and the only one who knows is the priest who says nothing, what then? Great question, right? And you could see how tempting it would be for a priest to realize, oh man, I had the wrong intention. If I say something, forget just the fact that I'm going to be embarrassed, right? Think of the consequences for a poor person who needed to bring an offering, paid like all the money he had to pay for that animal, walked with that animal all the way to Jerusalem, maybe from far away in the land of Israel. Maybe it took him a week to get there. Brought his offering, did everything correctly. The priest accepted it from him and then committed this error. And then rendered the thing pigul. Now, the kares aspect of this, that actually doesn't affect the owner. Once it became pigul, that's already, the offering was disqualified, right? And so it did not achieve an atonement for that person. So the temptation would be very strong. I was just talking about this with my friend Marcus Freed. We don't know, I haven't heard anyone tell me yet, was there some kind of a fund from the priest or communal offerings, or, was there some kind of a rectification when the priest made a mistake to at least, help out this poor guy who needed to bring an offering so that, he gets a replacement animal at that point so he can bring another offering and fulfill his own obligation, since it was no mistake of his when the priest messed up. So that would be, so you can see why the priest might be very tempted to stay silent. Now, if he did stay silent, he's the only one who knows. And so we would wonder, I think this is what you're asking, Sharon, did this guy achieve atonement? He thinks he did. He'll never know otherwise if the priest maybe convinces himself, you know what, I didn't have bad intent. I had good intent. But deep down he knows he had the wrong intent. I don't know. I just don't know. This is not a situation, as far as I know, covered by the tzitz, right? That would cover, all priests being impure when they're bringing up offerings. There's a whole bunch of errors that priests could commit that are atoned for by the tzitz, the front plate of the high priest. But I don't think this is one of those. Possibly, hopefully, the fact that, this guy who tried to bring his sin offering and it wasn't actually brought, perhaps the goats of Yom Kippur would ultimately atone for him. And, he wouldn't have to worry about that mistakes were made. I just don't know the answer to your question beyond that. I'm just hoping that somehow it gets covered in the end. If nothing else, by the goats of Yom Kippur the following year. That's what I've got for us tonight, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Sunday, at the regular Sunday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a good night, good vach, Shavua Tov.